Welcome everybody to Debunking the Myths of Point Reyes, a webinar event hosted by the Coalition to Save Point Reyes National Seashore. We've got a great lineup of expert presenters for you who will be addressing many of the myths and misinformation regarding management of Point Reyes National Seashore by the National Park Service, the private commercial cattle ranches in the park and their environmental impacts, the economics of ranching, the threats to the Tule elk, the history of the native peoples, and more. This event was prompted by the Park Service's determination to sign what is called a Record of Decision by July 14th, in which the service intends to extend the ranch leases for another 20 plus years and allow them to expand their operations to additional livestock, growing row crops, running B&Bs, and more. My name is Matt Maguire, and I'll be your MC for the evening. I will be briefly introducing each of our 8 speakers at the beginning of their presentations. My experience is that I'm a former 2-term Petaluma City Council member, and I'm currently the president of the board for Friends of Lafferty Park. I've been a longtime advocate for social justice, the environment, and the public's right to access open space. Before I introduce the first presenter, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement on behalf of our Native American partners. For those in Marin County today, we are on the unceded and stolen land of the Coast Miwok people. We honor and pay respect to the people who cared for these lands since time immemorial and who continue to care for these lands following indigenous traditional beliefs and knowledge. And just before we start the meeting, I want to note that we convene with the endorsement of Dr. Marty Griffin. Marty, now 100 years old and still fighting, was involved in the creation of Point Reyes National Seashore. He's the founder of Audubon Canyon Ranch and wrote the book, Saving the Marin Sonoma Coast. Marty is adamant that the ranches honor their original agreement to leave the park, which they were to do over 20 years ago. We thank Marty for his vision, his persistence, and his inspiration. To introduce our first speaker, we have Theresa Harlan. Theresa is a Kiowa Pueblo / Jemez Pueblo and the adopted daughter of Elizabeth Campigli Harlan, a Coast Miwok, and John Harlan. She has a long history working in the Native American community as an art writer and curator. She is now advocating for the restoration of her family's Coast Miwok home at Point Reyes National Seashore and a nomination for the National Register of Historic Places. Theresa?
Thank you, Matt. I'm talking and sharing from Vallejo, the unceded and ancestral lands of the Patwin people. So my first slide is about the myth of ranch history is Point Reyes National Seashore history. The living history of Point Reyes National Seashore begins with Coast Miwok existence. This history is from time immemorial with an archeological record of more than 10,000 years. Indigenous peoples' traditional ecological knowledge shaped a healthy and biologically diverse world, guided by a cosmology that included reciprocity and an understanding of finiteness. Coast Miwok people did not relinquish their lands. They still know it as their ancestral home. And ranching is a recent history on the Point Reyes Peninsula. Myth of the West. Manifest Destiny portrayed Indigenous people as incapable of existing in a Western civilized world. Anytime you hear anyone say American Indians lost their lands, know that this is false. Indigenous peoples strategized, negotiated, and fought by weapons and treaties and courts to keep their ancestral homelands. For too long, Point Reyes National Seashore has been centered on anyone but the original peoples. So now we're looking at a map. This map shows Coast Miwok and Pomo villages during the Spanish mission period. This is a glimpse of the number of villages in Marin and Sonoma counties in the 18th and 19th centuries. When visiting Point Reyes National Seashore, I want to know village names. Where are the signs for the villages? Where are the signs for Calapatamal, Pasaluma, Otococha, Onolima, and others? This is important history to be told. The people's response was not necessarily subdued to outsiders. In Benjamin Madley's book, An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, he writes from 1820 to 23, Pompano, a Coast Miwok, led other escapees from San Rafael Mission and raiding missions across San Francisco Bay Area, and he was executed in 1824. After Mexico took over from Spain, the Point Reyes Peninsula was divided into 3 ranchos, Mexican land grants. And then land ownership moved to different owners, and by the late 1850s, under California statehood, the Shafter brothers and a son-in-law, Charles Howard, owned most of the Point Reyes Peninsula. It's important to note that from 1769 to 1846, the California Indian population is estimated to have dropped from 310,000 to 150,000 people. So roughly about 20 years after the depictions that you saw on the last map, Coast Miwok village names are not included in this 1860 map from the Bancroft Library shared by Dewey Livingston. Instead, you find dots with the identifier Rancheria to represent Indian villages. On the left is the Western Shore with the 2 blue arrows, which shows rancherias at Marshall Beach and Laird's Landing. And you also see the word cabin above Sacramento Landing. And on the right, the 3 dots, rancheria dots, are shown at Reynolds Cove. And so during this time, Coast Miwok people continued to live in their homelands in Marin and Sonoma counties, feeding their families on food gathered, fished, and hunted, and some working on ranches. Again, it's important to note now, by 1846 through 1870, under the US rule, California Indian populations fell even further from 150,000 to 30,000. These population numbers are from Benjamin Madley and his book. So here's what the Rancheria dots at Laird's Landing looked like in the 1940s. On the left side, you see a photograph of Bertha Marcella Felix Campili. She is my maternal grandmother. And on the right side, you see a little bit of the homes. You see the house, you see a cabin and a shed. And that's how some of the property looked. We had more buildings. My grandmother worked as a ranch cook, and my mother's extended family also lived on Marshall Beach. So the whole family lived on Marshall's Beach and Laird's Landing. And I want to say it wasn't easy making it to the 20th century to this point, because my grandmother and her ancestors, the Tamal people, they had to survive the brutality of genocide and murder and rape, starvation, and disease. Coast Miwok people witnessed the bulk of their ancestral homelands occupied by outsiders and their cattle. So I want to share a little bit about Point Reyes National Seashore ranching history and what's been omitted. The Shafter brothers and their son-in-law, Charles Howard, ran a ranch empire of the tenant ranches. They also employed pernicious methods to guarantee no contest from Coast Miwok people. From this quote from Robert Heiser, collected by C. Hart Merriam, Henrik Clausen, Howard's ranchman, used school census records to identify where Coast Miwok families lived on the west side of the bay. And then Howard ordered his men to evict them, meaning Coast Miwoks. So, quote, the men went there and tore down the Indians' houses while one of their number stood by ready with a gun to punish any Indian who might resent the destruction of his home. As a result, most of the Indians crossed the bay and scattered and soon became practically extinct, end quote. So we also need to note that in 1851 through 52, the California state legislature authorized $1.1 million to suppress Indian uprisings. So this meant that any white man could murder an Indian if they were in the way or if they interfered. And so this is the environment that Coast Miwok people lived, my mother's ancestors lived in. So now back to my family, Felix, the Felix family at Laird's Landing. You can see the orange arrow pointing to the house. That's the house that my mother's grandfather, Joe Felix, and his brother, Ben Felix, built. They built that house, they built another shed, and they also built 2 homes at Marshall Beach. So these, and also there was a daughter, Celestina of Euphrasia and Domingo Felix. They settled there sometime in the 1800s. Celestina watched the children for when the people were at work. And she also watched some of my mom's siblings. And so this is part of the untold history of Point Reyes National Seashore. So here we are jumping to the 1950s. After my grandmother died in 1945, the neighboring rancher, the Turney Dairy Ranch, served my uncle Victor Souza with eviction papers in 1953. You see the headline, Indian says family squatted in 1830. Squatted is a legal term because at that time, squatters' rights required that a person establish a claim, live on the property for 5 years, fence it without permission, and pay taxes. My uncle Victor Souza had to prove that our family lived on the land before 1878, before that squatters' right law went into effect. His attorney, William Wysick, is quoted to say, everyone in court agreed that the family lived there long before 1870, but under the ruling, it is impossible to establish it legally, end quote. My uncle had the oral testimony of a woman named Mary Pinsotti, who said that the family lived there when San Francisco was Yerba Buena and a forest. All across the United States, Native people's lands were taken due to lack of record of property tax payments. So my uncle lost his case and appeal, and he died in 1966. Myth, people don't want to know. People do want to know. They want to know about Native Americans. They want to know about California Indians. They want to know about Coast Miwoks. There's Native movements all across the United States right now, and they're successful in part to broad cross-racial, cross-cultural participation and support. So below I've listed some recent publications. We Are the Land, A History of Native California. And also I want to point out that William Bauer Jr. is a citizen of Round Valley Tribes. There's also the recent article by David Trower, also Native, Return the National Parks to the Tribes. And also, if you want to know more about my family, you can read Peter Burns' article, Tamal Huye, Coast Miwoks Fight for Recognition at Point Reyes National Seashore. So I'm going to end with this slide. Fix the imbalances of hidden histories. In 2016, Crystal Echohawk led the Reclaiming a Native Truth Project, a $3.3 million project, the largest survey of Americans about Native Americans. What she found was that the largest barrier is the invisibility in the minds of the public, the invisibility of Native people. Fixing the imbalance of hidden truths in history is to tell the story of Coast Miwok people at Point Reyes National Seashore in a big way. Colonial erasure of indigenous peoples is at work when a 170-year rancher history is celebrated through a listing of the National Register, and 10,000 years of Coast Miwok history remains buried. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Theresa, for a nice, concise summary of a lot of history there. Very nice. Our next speaker is Laura Cunningham, and Laura is the California Director of the conservation nonprofit Western Watersheds Project. She's a biologist and author of the book, A State of Change, Forgotten Landscapes of California, published by Heyday in 2010, which explores the historical ecology of the Golden State. Laura?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Theresa, and thank you, Matt. I'm just going to jump back in time here briefly. My first slide is the kind of the myths of conservation grazing, which is a greenwashing way to cover up these coastal prairies that Native Americans cared for with cultural fire, taking care of the Tule elk. And it's actually, there's a lot of myths here. So next slide. This is actually a painting I did of coastal prairies. And this is Yerba Buena, San Francisco, 500 years ago, taken care of by tribes, elk antlers. And this is what a national park unit should be. It should be to restore this. Tule elk herds used to roam all over Central California and the coast. They were native to Point Reyes National Park quite a long time ago. Grizzly bears fished for salmon, coho salmon, even in Lagunitas Creek. There's still salmon trying to eke out a living in Point Reyes National Seashore. Now, there are remnants of coastal prairie that have not been described very well by the Park Service or even researchers studying coastal prairie. And I've discovered some of them on El Ranch Road, and they're ungrazed and full of wildflowers. This was a non-drought year, but they are lush. You can see there's no bare ground whatsoever. One of them is Idaho fescue, which actually is one of our prominent California coastal prairie bunch grasses. It has deep roots that go down 6 feet. It holds soil moisture. You could not pull it out with your hands. It is a perennial grass, might be hundreds of years old. Another coastal prairie grass is Pacific reed grass. And you can see here they have this beautiful symbiotic biological soil crust with mosses, lichens. It's a ecosystem that goes deep into the soil. The deep-rooted bunch grasses in the coastal prairie with this biological soil crust, and you can see the roots go down very deeply. When domestic livestock trample and graze across these coastal prairies, native coastal prairies, they're like ice cream plants, so they get eliminated very quickly. The result in this third illustration is basically what we see at Point Reyes National Seashore now in the livestock operation areas, the dairies and the beef ranches. There's no longer any deep-rooted bunch grasses. They've been grazed out. There are bare soil, weeds, and manure is dumped on these former coastal prairies and the myth of carbon farming. This is a feeding area, confined animal feeding operation on a dairy, and it's just mud. I mean, this is not what you want to see when you come to a national park. They grow silage in the park it's a type of hay for the dairies, and this brings invasive weeds. They may look sort of pretty, but these are Eurasian weeds, and they really do not belong in a park. Just a quick comparison of Tule elk and the landscape. Their footprint is light compared to cows, dairy cows. I mean, they can weigh twice as much. Here again, I'm touching an Idaho fescue bunch grass, a perennial 100-year-old old growth prairie. And next to it, I'm standing on an overgrazed non-drought year. This was a nice rainy year and a cow pasture. There's really no comparison. At the end of summer, the cow pastures are bare dirt and weeds, and it's probably twice as worse during this drought. A hoof print of a Tule elk compared to a cow. Tule elk pellets compared to cow manure. My painting of a coho salmon, and these are the population at Point Reyes are federally protected, and they're not doing well. This is actually Olema Creek, critical habitat, where beef cows have just completely eroded the stream, and I've never seen it this bad, and very not working mitigation measures to try to halt the stream bank collapse and erosion. The dairies are often, you can see the cows in the water, pooping and peeing, too much manure, they don't know what to do with it. This is a liquefied manure pond where they store dairy manure and then they spread it onto fields. This is a national park. It's actually surprising that this happens. And wrapping up, the biodiversity of Point Reyes National Seashore is incredible. I mean, I've never seen so many rare species, sensitive species, threatened and endangered species. We don't want to see barbed wire fences, trucked in alfalfa hay, modern, not historic dairy barns. We didn't come to a park to see that. What we'd like to see, thank you, Matthew Pulverosa Klein, for your beautiful vision of the Tomales Elk Reserve. This is what people come to see, the wildlife, the beautiful scenery. This could be a Yellowstone of the Pacific. Thank you.
Very nice. Thank you, Laura. Our next speaker is Diana Oppenheim. Diana founded forelk.org, a grassroots organization fighting to protect the Tule elk in Point Reyes and to engage the public. She spent 3 years volunteering to restore the coastal dune ecosystem within the National Seashore and earned the title of Volunteer of the Year in 2018. And I will just make a note that a few days ago, Diana delivered 100,000 signatures on petitions to the Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C., delivered them by hand. And the petitions were signed by people who wanted to protect the Tule elk in the seashore. Diana?
So just to give a little backdrop, there are 6 subspecies of elk in the United States. You can see there's the eastern elk and the Merriam's elk. Both are extinct. There's the Manitoban elk and the Tule elk, both of which were thought to be extinct, but due to some luck and some conservation work, they are now a little bit populated. And then there's the 2 sort of the most common ones you might see, the Rocky Mountain elk, which are populated at 850,000, and the Roosevelt elk, which are the really big ones. So this is a map of California, the historic native range of the Tule elk. They were estimated to be at around 500,000 Tule elk who roamed most of California. You can sort of see where Point Reyes and San Francisco is. So most of California west of the Sierras. And it's important to note that between 1800 and 1870, as Theresa sort of mentioned during the colonization and the gold rush in particular, most of the Tule elk were hunted to near extinction. And in 1880, this is an unknown number, but an estimated 12 individual elk were found actually by a rancher, Henry Miller. So this is a map on the left. Since those 12 elk were found and federal protection was implemented statewide to protect the Tule elk, they were reintroduced to 24 isolated herds throughout the state. Those yellow dots are the herds. And I'll just point out here too that there's an estimated 5,700 elk in the state, and that is up to 1% of their original population. So this has been a huge genetic bottleneck. So all the 5,700 elk came from the 12 individuals. So there's a huge stress on their gene alleles and genetic diversity that are imperative for long-term survival. So isolated herds, while they're great, they're not connected, and they need to be there need to be migration corridors to really increase the genetic diversity. And one other thing to point out is that this estimated 5,700 is a little bit conservative and potentially dated, and it does not account for the recent die-off of elk that is happening in Point Reyes currently. So again, on the left, I know the text is a little bit hard to read, but that basically just all the 24 isolated herds throughout the state, it just lists what they are. So it's a mixture between public land and private land, and Point Reyes is listed there. So Point Reyes National Seashore is restricted use land. It's theoretically some of the most protected land in the United States. This is also the only national park in the world where you can view these elk. And this is also, in Point Reyes, it's the public best chance at seeing these animals. So the other elk herds, like I said, are public or private lands. They're smaller herds, and it's very rare to see them. So Point Reyes is really kind of the best way for people to see these amazing animals. A little bit about their biology. They're the smallest of the subspecies. A healthy male bull will weigh between 400 and 700 pounds, females between 350 and 425 pounds. And something that Laura sort of mentioned is that they co-evolved with California native plants. So they've been around for tens of thousands of years. And so they did co-evolve with all the native plants. On the bottom of this slide, it shows all the many different plant communities that are utilized by the elk. They will utilize a wide range of plant communities, even though they have preferred plant communities, but they will eat in valley grasslands, which is mostly exotic grasses at this point, but also the oak savannas, foothill woodlands, the yellow pine forests, even riparian areas. So this is a map of Point Reyes. The sort of greenish area is wilderness, designated wilderness. The yellow areas are commercial industrial ranching areas within the National Seashore. And the striped areas are where the herds, the 3 Tule elk herds exist in Point Reyes National Seashore. And so on the very top is the Pierce Point Reserve. So that was where in 1978, they were reintroduced into Point Reyes National Seashore. So 10 elk were put there. There was an 8-foot fence that kept them trapped inside of that peninsula. And after about 20 years, their population grew to a decent size. And there was a 1998 elk management plan that was created that recommended a management practices, including establishing a free roaming herd. So in 1998, 28 elk were moved to the Limentor Beach for a free ranging herd. It's important to note that there was actually 40 elk that were supposed to be moved, but they were in quarantine, and 12 of them were shot and killed after having been found with Johne's disease. So the 28 healthy elk were released into the Limentor Beach herd. At some point, the Limentor Beach herd, a few individuals swam across Drake's Estero and established the Drake's Beach herd. So there are 3 distinct herds in Point Reyes. 2 are free roaming, 1 is held captive. And the current numbers based on the 2020 census is the Drake's Beach herd, which is free roaming, is 139. The Limentor herd, which is free roaming, is 155. And the Tomales Point captive herd is sadly down to 293. So that was they just experienced a big population crash, a decline of 1/3 of the herd, which I'll talk about later. So why are the elk fenced in at Tomales Point? When they were introduced, and to this day, it was to prevent interruptions to the cattle ranchers that are adjacent. So all those yellow areas, the elk were put into the point and fenced off to prevent the elk from encroaching on land that is leased to the cattle ranchers. So since 1978, in the captive herd, there have been 4 big population swings within Tomales Point. The Park Service has said that there's a carrying capacity of 350 animals, and they have a hands-off approach to wildlife. So there are natural ebbs and flows in population. They try to have a hands-off approach to wildlife management. But a natural approach to wildlife, any population or natural population management, there's 4 main factors. So there's the birth and the death of the animal, and then there's immigration and emigration. So those that can come in and out. And with an 8-foot fence, the Park Service took away half of the natural ways that the population would manage themselves. So elk cannot come in or come out. So they're left just to the birth and the death rate. So that is not a hands-off approach. It is not natural approach. And so this means that when times are good and there's good water and good forage, the population grows. Typically the excess amount of elk would be able to leave the park or leave that section, but they are not allowed to, so that when times go bad like they are currently, and there's a drought and the forage dissipates and there's lack of minerals in the soil, there's huge population crashes. This has led to a lawsuit that was dropped last week. So the Harvard Animal Law Clinic sued the park essentially for mismanagement of the Tule elk and failure to protect the Tule elk. And this came after a huge amount of work from activists and concerned citizens and wildlife lovers. So last summer, there was plenty of warning signs that was handed to the park, photos of dried up water sources, instances of irregular elk behavior, so on and so forth. The park dismissed it. And they said that there was plenty of water, but when they came out with their 2020 census and 1/3 of the herd had died, they said it was not due to lack of water, but lack of forage. But they conveniently and thankfully just started to implement water, which I think, and this is up for debate, but the public pressure has been for water. So the Park Service provided water. The Park Service has said that it was not due to lack of water, but lack of forage. So if they were really concerned about the population crash, they would have also provided forage. But I think they are probably responding to public pressure. And that is exactly what the lawsuit is addressing as well. Next slide, please. And a recent report from Tule elk biologists and experts, they just sort of listed different solutions that could help with Tule elk population control. And these are just what is listed. And so it's up to you to decide what factors you want to include. Are these factors, do they include the long-term survival of the elk? Do they prioritize the elk? Do they prioritize ranching? These are just a list of solutions that are out there. Contraception would be a short-term solution. Supplemental water and feed would be a short-term solution. Lethal removal would be a solution to control population, whether you agree with that or not. You could also remove the fence and allow the wildlife to mitigate their own population, and you could establish a movement corridor as well. And so there are plenty of solutions out there. We just ask that you assess what's motivating your decision. And in my opinion, the long-term survival of the species that's coming back from the brink of extinction is an important thing to consider. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Diana. I think it's appropriate at this point to mention that as of today, reporter Peter Byrne has an article out in both the Pacific Sun and the North Bay Bohemian titled The Death by Design, How the National Park Service Experiments on Tule Elk. It does go into the scientific studies as to the appropriateness of locating the herd of elk at Pierce Point. It also discusses, and I will warn you, it's fairly grisly, some of the quote unquote culling of elk, including healthy pregnant elk in the Drake's herd, et cetera. But I recommend that you read that if you want to be well informed on this issue. Bob Johnston taught environmental planning at UC Davis from 1971 to 2005. He's been a local planning commissioner and has served on many state and federal boards. And I will note he is a resident of West Marin. Bob, fire away, buddy.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk just about the economics of ranching. And I'm doing this because this is an argument made a lot by the ranchers and the county and the park itself. So I'm going to start with my conclusions. Next, please. This will be amazing to a lot of people. Ranching in the park results in a net economic loss to the United States, and I will explain that. It's also insignificant at the level of the county. And when you do economic analysis, typically you do nation, state, and local. In this case, I'll just do national and local analysis to catch the numbers. To the contrary, tourism produces a significant benefit to the country and a large benefit to the county. And then third, I want to add to this slide that these are uses that compete with each other. Often the politicians say that, the people like to look at the ranches. This is pure BS. This is rural nostalgia, it's called. This is not the case anymore. Ranching reduces tourism by degrading the coastal prairie lands that people clearly, if you interview them, tell you is why they come to the park, to see the natural landscape. And also ranching reduces the number of elk, which is really quite popular in the park. It's listed as number 2 or number 3 reason why people come to the park. Next. So this is an amazing fact. These are standard government numbers. Ag production in Marin County in 2018 was 94 million. The total county gross domestic product, that is the total of production in the county, was 24 billion. So run the numbers, you get 0.4%, okay? The ag in the park is about 20% of the ag countywide in Marin County. So you end up with 0.08%. That is less than 1/1000th of the economy in Marin County. Okay, I was amazed by these numbers myself, but it's reflected in the very small amount of employment on these ranches and other ways to verify that. So it will not hurt the Marin economy if we terminate the ranch leases. So this brings up the larger question of are dairies and ranches even viable? Why do we have them in the park? Dairy and beef operations lose money on average. This is an amazing thing. Environmentalists have been saying this for 20 or 30 years. Ag subsidies are one of the largest categories of subsidies in the United States. It's the most socialized sector in the economy. The average federal subsidy to each, that is individual Marin dairy, on average was $27,000. And the data comes from the Environmental Working Group, if you're interested, EWG. Cattle ranches are not as highly subsidized, but their feed is subsidized in a variety of ways to about 6% of the wholesale price of beef. That doesn't sound like much, but of course that's somewhere around their profit margin. So that makes a difference whether you stay in business or not. In addition, the seashore, that is the park, charges a land rent per cow, per head of cattle that's about half the going rate elsewhere in the county. And that's a subsidy of about $6 million a year to these dairies and beef ranches. It's a significant amount of money in this park. The seashore also pays for most improvements in the parks. The only documentation I can find, the average seemed to be about $500,000 a year over a several year period, but they take care of all the buildings, the fences, they just added all the water troughs and so on throughout the park. I think if the public knew this, they might not like it. Costs are going to go up, however. Air quality regulations are getting tougher. The state's going to regulate methane from cow and cattle burping. It's fairly hard to regulate. Seaweed will not stop it from happening, putting seaweed in the diet. And the water quality regulations have gotten tougher recently. They now have to do water quality testing of the water leaving their parcels. And the California law says for all property owners, no pollution may leave the property. So they're going to have to do a lot more expensive control over their manure ponds, in my opinion. Tourism, on the other hand, is an economic benefit. Tourists visiting the park, that's about 2 million tourists in recent years, spend about $100 million per year. Most of that is spent in West Marin, and it supports about 1,000 jobs. So that's quite significant. It is a clean industry, and it imposes few costs on the county. This is all well known about tourism. And so last, I want to say that, again, I want to repeat, these are competing uses. The public overwhelmingly opposes continued ranching. The comments on the draft impact statement, 92% of people opposed continuing the ranching and the dairies. Only 2% of the many thousands of respondents to the draft EIS supported extending the leases. So the public overwhelmingly opposes continuing the ranching. And as I said before, ranching likely reduces tourist visits. It competes, it uses land, and it reduces the number of elk, which the people clearly do appreciate in the park. So I repeat, my conclusions are ranching in the park results in an economic loss to the nation, and it is insignificant in the Marin County economy. And second, tourism produces a significant net benefit. So you would think the answer would be clear to the park as to how to manage the ranching. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Bob. Next up, we have Ken Brower. Ken is an American environmental writer. He has written several books about the environment, national parks, and natural places. He authored the series, The Earth's Wild Places, which was published by Friends of the Earth in the 1970s. His most widely read book on Yosemite is in over 1,200 World Cat libraries. Many of his books have been published by the National Geographic Society. He is the oldest son of the late environmentalist David R. Brower. Ken?
This is, I like this picture because this is the very moment that the national park, the National Seashore began. President Kennedy is signing the legislation. And I know some of the people here, so I especially like this. The man 3 from the left is Stuart Udall. He's the Secretary of Interior, and he's the driving force in making this park happen. Kennedy, who's signing, there's a Camelot smile on his mouth, is another driving force. The real impetus for this park, we like to think it came from here, and there were a lot of local people involved, but the driver was the federal government. It was in a time when they made parks. The guy on the far right is my father. He's represents the environmental community in this session. Or conservation community was called it. Environmentalism wasn't a word yet. I'd like to think, I'm going to presume, since I knew some of these people, to speak to their reaction to this mythology we've been hearing about. I think I know what they would say. Point Reyes Ranchers Association and their advocates, the people who want ranching to continue, is an origin myth. And it's the myth that ranching was integral to this park, that it was formative, that it was always the idea that ranching would be an element of this park, and that it was to be here for forever, in perpetuity. I'll just give you a quote from the rancher's website, Elk Fences Now. They write there, and you can look at it, it's there today still. Congress created the Point Reyes National Seashore to protect not only the natural resources, but also the agriculture, mariculture, and fisheries that had shaped the landscape for the previous century. There's absolutely nothing in the law that says anything like that. This is a fabrication. The ranchers have on their website and elsewhere have described themselves as partners in the creation of this park. Yes, maybe, finally, but the fact is they were dragged kicking and screaming to the table. The first thing they did when they heard of plans of this park is send delegations to the Marin City Council to object, and the Marin City Council promptly joined them and decided they were against the park in any form before they'd even seen the draft of it. And they went and sent a delegation to Congress to fight it. They finally were persuaded that it was the way to go. The National Seashore idea began in the 1920s. It was the first seeds sort of were planted then. The people did it, folks did it. Organizations like the American Shore and Beach Association, which was founded in 1926. The ASBA, you've heard of it, I'm sure. You know their magazine, Shore and Beach. No, you haven't heard of that. I don't know of it either. I never heard of it myself. But these people are our antecedents. They are the people before us who cared about this park and its integrity, about the seashore and its integrity. And they laid the foundations for what we have in Point Reyes now, people like that. Park Service continued to refine this idea through the 30s and the 50s. The idea had an evolution. And in the course of that, it was consistent that the seashore idea was for scenic preservation and for recreation. Preservation of history and culture, it didn't enter into the thinking at all. There are parks that preserve history. There are historic parks and historic sites and historic monuments. And there are national parks that, as a secondary function, preserve culture or history. But this was never the case here. It never entered into the picture. What drove these people is that the shorelines are such a narrow province. They're just a little epithelium on either coast with 3,000 miles of nation between them. Elephant seals have to haul out on shores. They can't haul out in Utah. Cattle can. Cattle can graze all the way from the headlands of Point Reyes all the way to Kansas or further if they want, and they do. Snowy plover can't do that. Snowy plover can't nest in coastal dunes in Wyoming. It won't work. Black brant can't eat eelgrass in Oklahoma. These coasts are such crucial, valuable interfaces between sea and ocean. And they're such productive systems, and they're so unique. And why we have to have cattle there when we can have them all the way across the country is a mystery to me. And I think it would be a mystery to our forebears who created this park. The idea began with Conrad Worth, who was in the National Park Service then in 1935. And he later became, in 1951, he became the director of the Park Service. He argued for this park all the way through 1962, and the day that photograph I showed you happened, all the way to September 13th, 1962. He was arguing for this seashore. And he never once mentioned historical preservation or preservation of agriculture. He mentioned this place is important for its unusual scenic resources and its recreation opportunities. Never did he mention in all that time, from 1935 to 1962, did he mention preserving agriculture. It wasn't on his mind. The guy in the middle of the picture, I should have showed him, Clem Miller. He's handing, he's grinning over Kennedy's shoulder as he signs it. He authored the legislation, and he never once mentioned in trying to sell this idea to, yeah, he's holding the book under his arm, right over Kennedy's left shoulder. And that book is Island in Time. It's the book my father did at a Sierra Club. Everybody in this room has got a copy. Udall has a copy in his hand. And Clem in this picture has 28 days to live. He thought this was, he said, this is going to be the high point of my career. He didn't know how true that was, because 28 days from now, from the moment of this picture, he was killed in a plane crash. Kennedy, who's signing it, has a year and 9 days left. So these are the people I'm trying to sort of advocate for what their dreams for this park were, what their hopes for it were. Miller never mentioned it. He had to go back to Congress and persuade his colleagues that there wouldn't be ranching here forever. He had to persuade his Republican colleagues of that. There were Republicans in those days who were good conservationists. So it was never a selling point, and he never mentioned it, that ranching would be there. He convinced Congress that they would be gone. Same for Boyd Stewart. Boyd Stewart was a great old rancher who finally convinced most of his colleagues at Point Reyes to sell the land to the park. The business was dying. No kids wanted to go into the dairy business. They knew it was a dying business. And he said that to Congress. He testified to Congress, don't worry, these people will be out of there. What he didn't anticipate was what Bob Johnston talked about, that these people would be subsidized, and that the taxpayer, in effect, would support their ranches, which made it a very good business. So let me just finish with a line from my father at the end of that book. He had an publisher's note at the end of Island in Time, and he said, "The peninsula is what we have, and there is no more where it came from. It is part of the shore that must serve uncountable millions in the more crowded times to come. We need to have what it takes to act boldly in their behalf, those millions yet to come, to save enough in the first place, and to remember ever after that the important things are not those that we put on that shore, but those that we find have always belonged there. What has always belonged on that shore since the Pleistocene is Tule. What's belonged there forever is snowy plover and coyotes and mountain lions. The Tule elk came with us across the Bering Strait. They arrived before Theresa's ancestors came to Point Reyes. So they were there to meet them. What we have put on the shores is cows, and that's not what belongs there. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken. It's just so great to have the depth of experience and knowledge that you and some of the others in the coalition have, and really it's important that be shared. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Chance Cutrano. Chance is the Director of Programs at the Resource Renewal Institute, which I believe was founded by Huey Johnson, and he is a newly elected Fairfax City Councilman. Welcome to the club, Chance.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to this. I'll share my screen really quick. My name is Chance Cutrano, he, him, his pronouns. I am Director of Programs for Resource Renewal Institute, was founded by Huey Johnson, who was the 8th employee of the Nature Conservancy, responsible in part for saving the Marin headlands, along with Bolinas Lagoon with Dr. Marty Griffin, and actually for acquiring numerous parcels of Point Reyes National Seashore, the biggest being the RCA parcel that actually happens to now be ranched by the Nyman family. It's the Commonweal Ranch, as well as Kevin Lunny's G Ranch as well. Were both acquired by the Trust for Public Land in '77. And some additional parcels in the GGNRA, which is the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Sorry for the acronyms. So why I'm here, I'm tasked with the legal myths of Point Reyes National Seashore's pastoral zone. How will I do it in 10 minutes? Nobody knows, but we're going to try. So the outline, first myth, you hear it all the time that, you know, maybe these are private ranch lands. In fact, if you go to the visitor center at Point Reyes National Seashore and you just hang out, you'll have people look at the map and wonder whether or not they can actually access the majority of Point Reyes National Seashore, that big chunk right in the middle, which is the pastoral zone. The reason for that is because unlike most national park or public lands maps, for some reason at the visitor center at Point Reyes, that map is grayed out where all the ranches are, as opposed to being green, like a map you might find on Google Maps when you're looking for your public land where you can go take a hike or something like that. But we're gonna dispel that myth really quickly in short order, very easy one to dispel. The next, these working ranches were to remain in the seashore forever. That, you know, Ken started off on that. I'm going to get into a little bit of the nitty gritty for folks that can refer to this video as a resource in the future if they want to write letters to the editor, if they want to talk to friends and family, if they want to write to the Secretary of the Interior, who has the authority to determine what the future of this seashore holds. And the third myth, which is going to be brief but a little tactical, is to talk about how the National Park Service has claimed that it must maintain these operating ranches to maintain the historic ranching districts that exist in Point Reyes as of 2018. So let me just jump into that real quick. So as you know, the National Park Service created with the National Park Service Organic Act of 1916, the agency's mission, in part, to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. This impairment clause is something that comes up a lot. It comes up in litigation, the litigation that was filed last week to protect the Tule elk, which Diana mentioned earlier. And we'll see this come up over and over in the way that some of the enabling legislation for different national parks shows up. For Point Reyes in particular, you'll see the same image you recently saw. That wonderful photo with Ken's father, JFK, Clem Miller, and others that shows them signing this enabling legislation, which says to save and preserve for the purposes of public recreation, benefit, and inspiration a portion of the diminishing seashore of the United States that remains undeveloped. You'll note that they didn't slip cow in there, but it'll show up elsewhere in a different way. The main thrust of this enabling legislation is to preserve this island in time. As Ken was mentioning, the original intentions were, you know, not only recreation, but just the geological oddity that Point Reyes is was worth the preservation of this peninsula that's been traveling up the coast down from Southern California, and will continue that move along the San Andreas Fault. So jumping right into enabling legislation, this is part of the enabling legislation. You'll see the source at the bottom, but I want to bring attention to a couple things here. This is the first myth that, you know, this grayed out area on the map at the visitor center, that these are still, you know, ranches that are privately owned, privately run, that on private lands that we can't access. And what you'll see here is in the enabling legislation from '62, the secretary is authorized to acquire these properties as rapidly as funds are appropriated and become available. And they had trouble in '62 when they originally appropriated some money, about 14 million and change, and they had to up that allocation in 1970, but I'll get into that. But that's one piece. The next piece is the secretary is authorized to pay for any acquisitions which he makes by purchase under various sections of this title for their fair market value as determined by the secretary. So all of these ranchers were actually bought out of their ranches. The majority of them were paid in dollars. Some actually took land transfers. One ranch in particular, Home Ranch, actually took about 1,800 acres of federal land in Southern California in exchange for Home Ranch. So, you know, over the years of us working on this, we've been able to acquire all the original deeds and fact check some of these things and get a sense of who made how much money and the inner workings of those arrangements. Because the longer that the ranchers stayed, there are actually some discounts that they received. So the Park Service said, well, if we let you stay for 25 years, say, perhaps we don't have to pay you the full amount of the appraised value, the fair market value, which is actually what occurred. So they didn't make the exact amount that it was appraised for, but they did make millions of dollars and then begin to acquire properties right outside the seashore. Some of those properties are also protected via the Marin Agricultural Land Trust. This next section, so this is how the ranches were able to continue after they were acquired. And this is a common practice that the National Park Service deploys. And I've given previous talks about these things as well, but it's called the reservation of right of use and occupancy. And typically that's for, as you see here, fixed term of years or life. Here you'll see agricultural property on the date of its acquisition, as conditioned of such acquisition, shall retain for himself or his or her heirs and assigns a right to use and occupancy for a definite term, not to more than 25 years, or in lieu thereof, for a term ending at the death of the owner or the death of his or her spouse, whichever is later. And so the majority of the ranchers out there actually took these 25-year residence of use and right of use and occupancy, RUOs or ROPs. You'll see different acronyms for them in the literature, but that is what the majority of them took. A couple were on life estates, which are still current. The next section is, after talking about paying them the fair market rate, a right retained pursuant to this section shall be subject to termination by the secretary upon his or her determination that it is being exercised in a manner inconsistent with the purposes of section 459C through 459C7 of this title. And it shall terminate by operation with the secretary notifying the holders of those leases. So it wasn't that this is in perpetuity by any means. It was, we're going to lease this back as a condition in order to have an agreement with these ranchers. And when the secretary, if the secretary determines that these ranches are inconsistent with the purposes of the enabling legislation, the Department of the Interior has every right to terminate these leases, which in a similar fashion you saw play out just a decade ago as things were starting to bubble up around the Drakes Bay oyster debacle, and which carried through 2008, 2012, and then everything was basically settled in 2014, between 2012 and 2014. But that was another lease that existed and then was ultimately terminated once it expired. So the other thing important to note is that where appropriate, it's at the discretion of the secretary that he or she may lease federally owned land, which has been acquired by the secretary under these sections and which was agricultural land prior to its acquisition. And so that's why you're still seeing, even after 25 years, that the National Park Service exercises a certain discretion to continue to lease this property, which is contentious for a number of reasons. And I'll get into that in a second. That language that you saw, here's a perfect example of another national park in California that had ranching, which is Channel Islands National Park, originally Channel Islands National Monument. But you'll see similar language. The owner of any property may, as a condition of acquisition, retain for himself a right of use and occupancy and all such portions of such property for a definite term not to exceed 25 years or ending at the death of the owner or his spouse. So we see this in the National Park Service as it relates to private inholdings, private ranchers within national parks. It's very common language. And again, I highlight here that the secretary has, upon his determination that such property is being used for purpose incompatible or inconsistent with the administration of the park, shall terminate these leases, has the option to terminate these leases. So we actually saw in the 1990s, the National Park Service do just that. They ultimately terminated the leases for the ranches at Santa Rosa Island because they were inconsistent, water quality issues, degradation of streams, and other natural resources. And it did take a lawsuit to deal with some of that from the National Parks Conservation Association. But there are no ranches operating. There's just a historic ranching district at Channel Islands. But we still have ranches in Point Reyes. So what's going on there? Well, here's the chronology of the leasing. So 1962 to 1970, the Park Service is trying to acquire a number of these parcels. And the important thing to note here is that as the the Park Service was doing this, there were all the speculators were coming in and purchasing up all the other pieces of land. And so in 1970, Congress actually had to increase land acquisition funding to $57.5 million to acquire all the ranches. However, I should note that there's a special statement in there about the intent. And Senator Alan Bible actually had some language about the intent to continue ranching and dairying until the secretary determined that such a use was incompatible with the seashore. This is something that that some academics that support the ranchers and others have pointed to, saying there's legislative intent, it's in the congressional record. As you saw, it was not in the enabling legislation. It just was spoken of by one senator in the congressional report, and that's what everybody's pointed to. So that's where some of the contention arises. In 1970, between that period and 1983, all of the other parcels were being acquired. I put here, obviously, cows continued to graze, smiley face. The National Park Service continues to acquire ranches. And then in 1983, we do have some documents that show the Park Service pointing back to that legislative intent, saying that there was congressional intent, so long as the Secretary of the Interior deems this to be a consistent use. But if it's incompatible with the purposes, they could terminate those leases. But they did intend to switch the ranchers over to special use permits once those 25-year ROPs expired. In 1999, and I'm pointing to that, you see here's the special use permit bit. And this is for the video, of course. The next thing, 1999, we have some internal documents from the Point Reyes staff, from former Superintendent Don Neubacher. I'm not sure if he authored this, but this did come from the Pacific Coast, the Pacific Regional Office to Congress, stating that the NPS park policy clearly prohibited an extension of those reservations of use and occupancy due to NPS 53. It's a Park Service policy, and I'll explain that in a minute. But that's another reason they moved them over to these special use permits, because they couldn't extend those reservations of use and occupancy. It was prohibited in their policy. But this is a really interesting briefing statement that you all should look at later when the video's recording is posted. The ranches were then transitioned, and then over between 2000 and 2015, all of those special use permits, the first iteration, the second iteration, expired, and the Park Service began to prepare a ranch comprehensive management plan to potentially offer 20-year leases to the ranchers. And before I get into that, and I know my time is running, so I just wanted to briefly note here for the video, Park Service policy NPS 53, it's just about special park uses that the Park Service isn't really managing under a concession contract, and it's not prohibited by law or regulation. It might be in the statute, which you saw the Park Service does have discretion to authorize those ranches, or it perceived itself to have that, and to continue that based on legislative intent. But it also couldn't continue special park use permits if it created unacceptable impacts on park resources or values, or I bolded another, result in a conflict with other existing uses, such as the Tule elk, which Diana pointed to, or the restoration of coastal prairies, which Laura pointed to as well. And that's when my organization, along with Western Watersheds and the Center for Biological Diversity, filed a lawsuit in 2016 and asked them, instead of that ranch comprehensive management plan, to pull that back and to do a general management plan with the first ever environmental impact statement, the first ever robust review of environmental impacts from ranching at Point Reyes in like 37 years. And so that was outdated. The judge agreed, a settlement followed, and now we're in the middle of that process. Of course, our local congressman tried to step in, which was sort of unconventional in the middle of that process. And in yet another showing that this is not meant to be in perpetuity, Congressman Huffman's House Bill HR 6687 suggested in the middle of this planning process that he wanted to provide interpretation of Congress's intentions to continue to authorize ranching, and wanted to direct the Park Service to manage for separation of elk, and potential relocation, and also directed the Park Service to issue 20-year leases in the middle of an environmental review process. And this was approved by the House, and also the Trump administration was like, great job, Jared. So that occurred. Here's some language for the video, but I'm not going to go over that. But it just highlights the different things that Jared Huffman, our congressman, put into his legislation, HR 6687, in the middle of an environmental review process for the future of the National Seashore that the public was trying to weigh in on. The final thing I wanted to address just real quickly, the myth of these designation of, the need to keep commercial operations at scale in order to maintain historic integrity of these ranching districts. So you may have read in Peter Burns, one of his recent publications, that instead of creating an indigenous archeological district for the entirety of the National Seashore, the Park Service decided to scrap that and go for ranching districts. In 2018, they finalized these. And there's both a 22,000 acre ranching district for the Point Reyes Peninsula dairy ranches, as well as the Olima Valley dairy ranches, about 14,000 acres of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, which is managed by Point Reyes National Seashore. So they did this, and the rationale was that this is how they can conserve cultural resources within the National Register of Historic Places. Once these are enshrined, they can then, protect and support the contributing landscapes and structures and make sure that they maintain their integrity. And in considering the impacts during the environmental review, they found that, if we decided to phase out ranches, it could result in a loss of pastures that are considered contributing sites, and that could result in losing integrity for these historic districts and could affect whether or not they'd stay listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And so that's where we're at with that. The challenge, which my organization has put forth in our comments, and this is again for the video, you don't have to read all this, but I'll just call out a few things. Even under the phase out of ranching, 7 qualities that are essential to historic integrity that were outlined by Dewey Livingston, who the Park Service contracts with, who's a local out in West Marin, which those qualities are location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and associations relating to ranching operations. Those could all remain intact, even with the phase out of ranching, such as we see at other historic ranching districts all throughout the National Park Service, whether it's Santa Rosa Island Ranching District at Channel Islands, which I mentioned earlier, or Hunter Hereford Ranch Historic District in Grand Teton National Park. And, there would still be historic ranch preservation subzones that would be managed for adaptive reuse and still protect the integrity of those 24 historic ranching complexes. And it still remains unclear why the Park Service is pushing back against the idea that we want to open these things up to the public so that we can better interpret or have more adaptive interpretation and educational opportunities. So we could bring in a Coast Miwok Living Cultural Center, so we could bring in new overnight or day use opportunities, whether that's drive-in camping or other things like that. It would also result in a reduction of wear and tear and some burden on the Park Service for upkeep for some of these facilities, which they currently do to support the ranchers. So unclear why there's pushback. We're saying that NPS only needs to look to other rural vernacular landscapes and historic ranching districts that are still on the National Register of Historic Places for inspiration. And if they only look there, they'll see all of the amazing things they could unlock at Point Reyes if we realistically consider all the alternatives out there, not just the one like the wish list that the ranchers put forward and that the Park Service is deciding to move forward with based on the Trump administration plan that's still moving forward. So that's my spiel. I'll be around for Q&A, but more at restorepointreyseashore.org. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Chance. A lot of information in a compressed time. You've done very well. I do think it is quite appalling that after the lawsuit was brought against the Park Service, they did go through the whole EIS process and came back with the exact same recommendation, which matches the Ranchers Association wish list as they did before the review process. And I believe our next speaker is going to speak to that. Ken Bouley is the Senior Director of Software Development at the analytics company FICO. He has written extensively about Point Reyes and coordinated the General Management Plan and Coastal Commission public comment analyses for the Resource Renewal Institute. He is currently chairman of the board for the Coho Salmon Land Trust, known as Sea Salt. Ken?
Thank you, Matt and Chance and everybody who spoke. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm addressing the myths of popularity and the myth of process. So some of the slides will go by quickly and I'll try to stick to the highlights. So the myth of popularity is that people like or love the ranches out in Point Reyes. And here's a quote here from our congressman who Chance made reference to. Point Reyes National Seashore, of course, is in Representative Huffman's district. And he says that people pretty much love it the way it is. We have actually two large data sets that we've collected as part of this process. One is the over 7,600 comments to the General Management Plan itself, and the other is almost 45,000 comments to the California Coastal Commission when they did their consistency determination. And what we did is we read all those comments for both data sets. It's important, it's the only really two large data sets we have, certainly the only two after the EIS came out. So in other words, data collected before that was in ignorance of the environmental impact of the ranches in the park. So please keep that in mind. There was also, by the way, just before I go to the results, a poll in the Argus Courier, which is the Petaluma newspaper. That poll asked, do cows belong in Point Reyes? And 80% of respondents said no and 20% said yes. That was a very small data set, but we looked far and wide for all the data we could get. And that 80-20, in Petaluma is the belly of the beast, so to speak, of ranching around. So that's another small data point that we have. But if we look at what we found in the large data sets, so on the top left is the analysis from the General Management Plan comments, and on the bottom left is from the Coastal Commission. So as you can see, 91% of the respondents to the General Management Plan were against the plan or against ranching in some sense, and about 2% were in favor of it. There's about 6% that were neither. A lot of those people said, we want more bike lanes and things like that, and didn't really come out one way or the other. More people spoke out on behalf of bike lanes than spoke out on behalf of ranching in Point Reyes. An even larger data set, the almost 45,000 comments to the California Coastal Commission, almost all of them were against a finding of consistency, which means against the plan. Literally 12 comments were in favor. And if you look at the graph on the bottom right, there's a 10 and a 12 right over each other. Excel, the graphic couldn't really show a thin enough slice for the comments that were in favor. That's why it looks a little confusing. So I mean literally 12, not 12,000, not 1,200, 12 comments in favor, almost 45,000 against. Of those 12, by the way, 3 were from the Strauss Dairy, 2 were from the Giacomini Dairy, 1 was from the Ranchers Association, and 2 were from the Marine Conservation League, 1 was from Malt. So the number of unbiased or disinterested comments in favor of finding of consistency, you could count on 3/5 of one hand. Vanishingly small amount of people spoke out in favor. So these are numbers, and I'll talk a little bit about why we have confidence in the numbers. We also, I'll go past this quickly. I don't expect everybody to read this, and you can get these materials, I know, subsequently. We also looked for keywords across the comments. This is in the California Coastal Commission consistency determination. And it's a way of finding how people actually feel about it. This man named Mark Walsh did a lot of the hard work here. By the way, it's RRI that ran the studies, or I helped run the studies with RRI. So that's who took the initiative to count all these comments. So what we did is we looked for keywords and found the number of times these keywords appeared in the comments. And keep in mind, 99 point something % of these comments were critical. So for instance, if you see on row 11, a mention of erosion, it's not because anybody said, I don't mind erosion, right? All these comments are against the plan and against the finding of consistency. And these are keywords, sort of like hot button topics that appeared in those comments. Okay, so I want to make just a few points about our analysis of these two data sets. One is it's not a poll. These were not polls or surveys, and so they're not subject to charges of bias in that way. It's not as though somebody stood outside the Sierra Club office and asked people their opinion. Everybody had the same chance to send in their comments, right? So what's happening is some people are taking the incredibly lopsided results at face value as a sign of some kind of bias. But it's the Park Service and the Coastal Commission that invited the public, everybody, to make comments. So there's no indication of self-selection bias or any other kind of bias in these data sets. Another point to make is that the public was concerned about a large number of things, not just the elk. I mean, I'm concerned about the elk. A lot of people are concerned about the elk, but it would be inaccurate and misleading to say that the majority, even to say the majority of these comments were about the elk. And I want to point out that the Marin Conservation League in their last newsletter said exactly that. Okay, so I'm not here to say it was a lie, but they told their membership that the vast majority of the comments to the Coastal Commission were simply about the elk. That is simply not true. It is inaccurate, and that those comments are a matter of public record. So, we're here to talk about myths, and sometimes things get said and then they get repeated after they're said initially, and that's how a misapprehension of the situation gets out into the public. A lot of people also say, well, local opinion is different, and what about what do the locals think? First of all, there are plenty of locals like myself who are in favor of restoring the park. There are far more people identified as local that spoke out against than for, just because the numbers are so lopsided. So in the general management plan, we did not, the comments to the general management plan, we did not have geography of the people making the comments. Sometimes we knew if we knew who they were personally, but it was not required. For the Coastal Commission, you could put in where you lived, and 93% of those people who gave their geographical origin were in California. 40% of those were in Marin. Sorry, not 40% of those, 40% in general, and 14% were in Sonoma County. So it would be inaccurate to say that only people at a distance or only quote unquote outsiders want the park restored and want ranching out. Inaccurate according to the data. Another thing that you hear a lot is, well, this was an orchestrated campaign. This quote, orchestrated nationwide campaign, came from an editorial in the IJ, from the editorial board. And, so there might be some subjectivity here, but I just think it's strange, in fact, wrong to characterize this as an orchestrated campaign. Well, a lot of groups, Center for Biological Diversity, RRI, In Defense of Animals, a lot of groups spread the word to their membership, and that's how democracy happens, right? There's structure in our society, and there are many groups that care about the environment, and their membership cares about the environment. So to call it orchestrated or to talk about urban outsiders and things like that, I think is a way of trying to obfuscate and deflect, and I think there's some disingenuous opinions out there as some sort of track covering that's going on out there. Another thing I'll say about this is we are very confident in our findings. We published all the findings, including how we characterized each comment. Some of this was a year ago, some of it was a few months ago, and we have not heard anyone challenge it. So it's publicly available. It will be in the information resources. We counted every comment. We did not run it through an algorithm, public sentiment analysis program. We read everything and we published everything. So, I mean, it's just a brute fact that virtually everybody that responded on behalf of removing ranching and restoring the park. There also is a lot of other opposition. I won't read all these for the sake of time. This will be on the slide and the video. The Miwok Tribal Council called it a travesty. There are letters from large numbers of conservation groups and local guides and photographers. The Coastal Commission, by the way, judged for consistency with conditions 5-4. And if you watch that hearing, there was a lot of exasperation. Some of the commissioners may actually be on this evening. Commissioner Bochco, for instance, was passionate and outspoken, and it narrowly got approved, and then that with conditions. So it's not as though this is flying by. I mean, there's a lot of outrage about this. As mentioned, 100,000, actually more than 100,000 signatures were delivered to Secretary Harlan just recently. And if you look at the op-eds and the letters in, it's hard to find letters in favor. There are some, but it's sort of a landslide. And so, not to mention protests, well-attended protests, some of those, by the way, during the pandemic, which would have kept the numbers down. So look around, count up the data, or look around anecdotally, and ranching is certainly not popular in the park. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit to process. I don't mean to pick on our representative, but he's influential, and a lot of us are surprised that he is in favor of continued ranching as he is. So he said recently, this has been an incredibly open process. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the process looks like to someone who wants restoration in the park and wants to see the end of ranching in the park. And that includes mostly everybody, mostly everybody who spoke out, as I mentioned. Okay, so first of all, we're only here because of the lawsuit that Chance mentioned. Okay, so an incredibly open process, but we wouldn't have had a chance to know about this, to make comments, to have an EIS, to make our voices heard if there hadn't been a lawsuit in the first place. That lawsuit, of course, expends resources of grassroots organizations, could have been spent on something else. As Chance mentioned, in the middle of this incredibly open process, Representative Huffman introduced a bill to try to seal the deal. So the court said you have to do a new plan and consider various options. And in the middle of that, Representative Huffman tried to get a law passed that would have made the court suit and the process meaningless. So that's the open process he's lauding, but he actually tried to scuttle that open process. I mean, it's very clear. This goes in a little bit of detail. Hopefully this makes sense to people. I'm going to try to get this part out as clear as I can. Plan B, which is the plan of the preferred plan of record, in other words, what the park is intending to do out here with respect to ranching in Point Reyes, includes a number of things that the Ranching Association asked for. They asked for it in a letter that they sent to the park in 2014. They copied Representative Huffman, Senator Feinstein, and a number of other influential people, the Marin County Board of Supervisors, et cetera. That table is things that they had asked for in that letter, and all those things are in the plan. Okay, so if you're following the open process so far, the public had to sue someone tried to exclude them from doing the process in the first place, and the plan that is being acted on is a virtual wish list, letter to Santa Claus from the Ranchers Association. One of those things I just point out was that the Ranchers Association asked the park to always call it a seashore and not a park. And I believe the reason for that is because there are some people who go around saying that there's a legal difference between a seashore and a park, and that in the seashore it's more appropriate to have commercial activity. There is no legal difference between a seashore and a park. There is none. They're both national park units. So it's just curious to me that the Ranchers Association asked the park to always use the word seashore and insist on it. And the park, in fact, is doing that in a fairly obedient manner. That same letter said that, well, where do things go well in our opinion? What is a model for commercial activities in a national park? That's Cuyahoga Valley National Park in Ohio. And the new superintendent in Point Reyes is Superintendent Kenkel, who was transferred from Cuyahoga to Point Reyes National Seashore. It may be a coincidence, but it may be that the plan is drafted and that many of these actions are being taken on behalf of the ranchers. The letter also asked the park to, and Chance mentioned this, put the ranches and the ranch lands on the National Register of Historic Places, which they did. Before doing that, they withdrew an application for an indigenous district on that same National Register. Now, the park has said that those two things are not related, that they did not replace one with the other, but the facts are there was an application for indigenous district. It was removed in 2015, so the year after that letter was sent. A couple of years later, the ranches were, there was an application for the ranches to be added to the register, and the year after that, they were added to the Register of National Historic Places. So, I mean, these things all could be coincidences, or, you may conclude, as I conclude, that the public input is not really operative here, that the ranch's input is what's really being, what's really calling the shots here. So to call this an open process, I mean, to me, I can't really take it very seriously. I think this is a vexing bit of theater. And I think the only motivation, frankly, is that it is minimally legal so that it carries on. But as was mentioned, that may be challenged. And that is it for my presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken. A lot of really important information here. And, it's good to go back to the source documents. It's good to document the public's stance here and continue to reiterate that to our elected representatives. Our last speaker is Todd Steiner. Todd is the founder and executive director of Turtle Island Restoration Network. You can find them on the web at seaturtles.org. They're a 30-year-old environmental organization that works to protect endangered species around the world. Todd?
Well, thank you. I'll start off by saying that that David Brower was my mentor, and our organization actually started out as a project of the Earth Island Institute. My talk today is about re-envisioning what the future of Point Reyes National Seashore can be. And this is more than just a pipe dream. I want to begin by saying that momentum is building to compel a new vision for the future of our national seashore. The currently proposed general management plan, as you have heard, is politically driven and anti-environmental. It has unleashed a flurry of grassroots opposition, and we are gaining momentum. This gives me hope. 100,000 citizens have signed a petition, more than 50 organizations, including civil rights, animal rights attorneys, scientists, restorationists, and businesses. And the original stewards of the land, the Coast Miwok people, are all actively voicing their opposition. Imagine Tule elk is the dominant ungulate on the California landscape. There was once 500,000 of these magnificent creatures foraging on vast native grasslands, browsing and grazing the landscape, and helping to actually shape its ecology. We can reimagine Point Reyes National Seashore's future so that it provides us a window of what the pre-European California coastal prairies once looked like and how its ecology was shaped by wind, fog, fire, and the dominant browsers of this amazing landscape. California coastal prairies are the most species-rich grassland community in North America, supporting a myriad of wildlife from top predators like mountain lions, not pictured here, best I could do as a bobcat, down to the diminutive long-tailed weasel. What an opportune time to restore and rewild, starting with the 1,000-acre McClure Ranch, which recently closed its dairy operation, presenting an opportunity to turn it back to the coastal prairie it once was. This can be the beginning of giving back, what ecologists refer to as managed retreat, so necessary if we are going to slow and hopefully reverse the biodiversity and climate crisis that threaten all life on this planet, including our own species. Native California coastal prairies, with only 5% remaining on the planet, are themselves endangered, classified as an environmentally sensitive habitat and protected by the California Coastal Act because so much of this habitat has been destroyed by human activities. Restoration or rewilding implies returning the land to a prior state. Although the goal must go beyond recreating some historical ideal, but rather restoring essential ecological functions that allow nature and evolution to reach new equilibriums, because nature is not fixed in time. Wind, salt spray, fire, and grazing and browsing by native species are evolutionary disturbances which affect shrubs and tree growth, helping to maintain coastal prairies. The accumulated organic matter, laid down over centuries, produces a rich, dark prairie soil that nourishes native species and sequesters carbon. Removing unnatural disturbance and invasive species allows dormant native seeds in the soil to grow and thrive. But humans who have destroyed these native prairies can also help heal them through restoration activities that speed up the process. So what are the benefits of rewilding? Helping recovered endangered species such as California freshwater shrimp and red-legged frogs, fish species like coho salmon and steelhead, and species of birds like the willow flycatcher and the bald eagle, all the way up to the great whales that are impacted by polluted water, leaving the seashore ranches and entering the ocean. Restoring coastal prairies includes repairing the trampled creek banks that run through it, allowing waterways to meander and create floodplains, which help to reduce excessive pollution and stream sedimentation that harm aquatic species like coho, which rely on cold, clean water. Restoration will help sequester carbon to mitigate climate change. And removal of invasive plants allow insects and birds to flourish. Restoration of current seashore ranch lands can help protect our planet for future generations, resolving a number of serious environmental problems that threaten our very existence. Reducing the release of climate change gases. The environmental impact statement identified ranching as the major source of the seashore's contribution of greenhouse gases, mostly in the form of methane released by cattle. Methane is a much more potent global warming gas than CO2, and a UN report says urgent steps are necessary to reduce methane if global warming is to be kept within the Paris Climate Change Treaty limit. The fact that native grasses have very long roots, which help them survive droughts and fire, also means these plants allocate a considerable proportion of their biomass underground, making native coastal prairies an effective, stable carbon sink, less impacted by the increasing fires and droughts we are now facing. Restoration will reduce water pollution. A couple of months ago, a water quality study at Kehoe Creek, which runs through seashore ranches, highlighted the chronic issue of highly contaminated water containing fecal matter from ranching operations. These waterways drain to the Pacific, impacting swimmers, surfers, kayakers, and they degrade the marine environment and the entire marine food web, all the way up to the endangered whales. Rewilding will create more recreational and educational activities for visitors. Returning seashore ranch land to nature will lessen current overcrowded paths and create enhanced outdoor and wilderness experiences. 18,000 acres currently dominated by ranching will once again become available for visitors to explore, deepening outdoor experiences for all of us, in essence, making the park 1/3 bigger for people and wildlife. Rewilding will also create educational opportunities for the public and generate additional opportunities to hire and retrain laid-off ranch workers, create early career internships for science-based students and recent college grads, and involve thousands of volunteers in learning the art and science of restoration. Turtle Island's program is ready to help now. In recent years, we have raised and provided Point Reyes National Seashore with millions of dollars, carrying out several important habitat restoration projects, and we would be delighted to assist with rewilding the seashore's coastal prairies, creating a win-win solution for people and wildlife. Right now, our native plant nursery is bursting with available native plants grown locally, harvested locally from seeds in the watershed, and are ready to be put out. It's time to heal our planet and turn back from the path that brought us to the climate and biodiversity crisis humankind now faces. And we can do it together. Thank you for listening and helping to envision a new future for Point Reyes National Seashore. And thank you to all the talented photographers who provided images for this presentation. Remember, we are powerful together, and together we can change the course of history on the Point Reyes Peninsula. Captured in this old Vietnam War protest poster is a quote from Sitting Bull, an historical figure of the Lakota people who united diverse Native American tribes and led to the historic victory at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and who never surrendered to the US government. He said, "If we join together, we make a powerful fist." Thank you for listening.
Beautiful. Thank you, Todd. Excellent, excellent. I want to thank everybody for joining us. As we said at the beginning, we will send information, both a link to a recording of this event, plus the information you see on your screen now, along with some additional information such as who to contact in public office, and where to go to write letters, etc., or access information. Once again, I want to thank everybody for joining us. This has been Debunking the Myths of Point Reyes, and keep educating yourself and keep advocating for our Point Reyes National Seashore.